Actively managing your personal brand is critical if you want to make a significant impact in the areas of your life important to you. I'm Garry Browne, the Personal Brand Catalyst. I've spent most of my life working in the world of branding products. More recently, I've been exploring the world of personal branding and wrote a book on this, Brand New, Brand You. And the podcast has come out of this as a way to share first-hand experiences from some of Australia's most recognised personal brands. Judy Friedlander is the founder and CEO of the non-for-profit organisation PlantingSeeds, whose flagship project, the B&B Highway, or Bed and Breakfast for Bees, Birds and Biodiversity, has grown from one B&B to over 120 in 3 years, with the regenerative corridors now in 3 Australian states. The B&B Highway has grown out of her desire to cultivate a greater appreciation of the environment we live in, as well as foster a greater understanding of the connections among communities. Before founding the organisation, Judy had an impressive media and journalism career. She worked as a newspaper editor and feature writer for The Australian, the Sun Herald and the Sydney Morning Herald. She was a producer at Channel 9 television, where she worked on research for her master's degree in interactive multimedia. Later, she completed her PhD at the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. Her studies and journalism experience impressed upon her that it is, in fact, important to walk the talk, and that biodiversity and environmental issues require much more than just research and writing. They require doing it as well. Throughout her decorated media career, Judy has always had a passion for both social and environmental issues. When she is not dedicating her time to planting seeds, Judy can be found at the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, working as a postgraduate researcher. Judy, thank you for joining us today on the Personal Brand Catalyst.
So Judy, thank you so much for taking the time to join today, and we are very privileged to have you be with us to share your thoughts, your views on branding, but also to talk about this fabulous concept of the B&B Highway.
Thank you.
As I mentioned in my introduction, you are the founder of PlantingSeeds. When we're talking about branding, Judy, how does PlantingSeeds fit into the brand? What does it actually describe?
Well, as soon as I actually think about planting seeds as a concept, I think of my mother, because my mother always used to say, Jude, you just have to plant some seeds and things will grow. And then working in the space that I work in, which is to do with environment and biodiversity, there is an implicit recognition that these things are complex and difficult, and you have to have faith. You have to put the work in, and you have to apply the knowledge, but you also have to give it over. You have to plant some seeds. It's a messy issue. It's a term, messy, that is often used in academic speak, and it's to imply that it's very complex. So when I think about planting seeds, I'm thinking about all the different ways that we can plant seeds to help biodiversity.
And is this one of your passions, the planting of seeds and biodiversity? Is this the origin and the heritage that you are trying to take forward?
Good question. In a way, I want to do much more than plant seeds. I want to see them grow as well. So it doesn't necessarily convey the fact that maybe it should be called planting seeds to become huge trees, but that doesn't sound as good.
It's a mouthful.
But yeah, no, it's really about, it's such a complex area. And I suppose it reflects my background and who I am, because I come from a journalistic background. I've done a PhD. I've become an advocate. I'm about doing now as well as communicating. So I suppose it's representing or reflecting all of that.
So what is your brand? If you were to put yourself out there and describe yourself as a brand, what is Judy to the outside world?
Well, I know you and I have talked about this, and it's such an interesting concept as a brand. And I recognise that in this day and age of the info glut, a term I like to use, which came up in my research, my academic research, that it's really helpful to come up with an idea that people can attach to you or can make sense of complexity. So yes, the brand and the person is really important. When I was doing my PhD, which was at UTS and the Institute for Sustainable Futures, I'll quickly explain that the PhD was all about how do you communicate the environment, how do you get people engaged with environmental issues in a really complex world when there's so much information and so much eco-anxiety around. And the research found that, yes, the person and the brand was absolutely pivotal. You think about the people like David Suzuki, you think about the people like Jamie Oliver, etc. Even someone like Costa, for example. I'm convinced there's 5 Costas because every time I turn on Instagram or Facebook or watch television, he's there. Yes, so I recognise that the brand is important. I think I'd call myself a reluctant brand because I'm not used to being the person that's being representative of the organisation. So my background is as a journalist. So I'm the person who used to do what you're doing. I would be there to ask questions and be in the background. And now I'm finding that I have to be there, and I recognise that. But I also believe that people can make a mistake if they're just presenting themselves and ignoring some vital other elements. So yes, okay, I will reluctantly acknowledge that I, as Judy Friedlander, can be a brand that can represent planting seeds, but it comes with a package.
And that I totally understand. And I would translate that slightly into the fact that you are leading the organisation, you're leading the charge, and so as a brand, you are taking the proactive approach to impact in the environment in which you wish to be. And so you're using all your talents in, whether it be in terms of journalism, your experience, etc., to take charge to really let people know more about biodiversity and everything else that it stands for.
I think I'm more comfortable now. I've come to this ripe old age.
Younger than me.
No. I'm more comfortable and recognising that, yes, I'm very keen to utilise what I know, how to gather knowledge, how to communicate knowledge, how to be an advocate, how to apply evidence as well, because having the training now with my research, etc., really honed that in, how to get people together as well. And just having done a PhD that was all about the environment and biodiversity, I suppose quite au fait now with what's happening in terms of biodiversity. And it's incredibly worrying. And you reach a point where you just think, if you don't do it, no one else, you just have to do it. You just have to work in this space. It's just too important.
So you're now feeling comfortable that you can not only articulate all the issues and lead the charge and be perceived as a brand. How do you think others perceive you?
It's an interesting question, Garry. I just came from a session that I'm participating in, which is a group of 8 women who are coming together for 8 weeks, and it's called Regeneration. And we just had to talk about how we perceive the others. And they said about me that they saw me in a certain way, which was really intriguing. And I don't necessarily see myself that way. They said that I'm a pocket rocket. Yep. They said that I've got crazy hair and I've got a lot of energy. And they talked about my drive for knowledge as well. Yeah. So I'd like to think that I'm perceived that way. I mean, I've been told quite often when I talk that people say, oh, I can see your passion, which always takes me a bit off guard because I don't realise that coming across that way. But I'm obviously very passionate about the cause.
But I think it's innate within you. I think it just comes. And so you don't see the passion because it's part of you. It's part of your DNA. Did they see anything else? I mean, you've just come from a session where they've told you what to think, but have you thought about that before today?
Have I thought about that before?
How other people perceive you?
Yes, I guess I have. I've been in different roles, I suppose, in my career and in my life. And when I was younger, even though I said before I worked behind the scenes as a journalist, there was a certain time when I worked in quite a prominent role in newspapers. My picture was featured on a weekly basis, and I used to write, and it was quite often I wrote about more personal things. And at that time, I guess I was recognised as well. And then I took a step back. And then I worked behind the scenes, and I worked in television, for example. And then I left for a while to live overseas. And it was a really good leveling experience and a humbling experience, because it made me realize that a lot of a brand, personal brand, is associated with the institution you work with as well. I think a lot of men I can see struggle with this if they've been working for a large corporate for many, many years, for decades, and they leave it and they don't have the organisation behind them and they grapple with it. So I actually think it's a great exercise for people to leave at a certain time when they're a bit younger and learn to find what they are passionate about and build something that they are passionate about that's associated with them. And going on from that, that's why I think I feel more comfortable about who I am as a brand, because the organisation that I started is something that I feel really strongly about and reflects very much about who I am and where I've come from and where I want it to go.
It's a really interesting topic. We could spend all day just on that component of those who absorb the identity of the corporate or organisation into their own brand identity, if they have one, and when they do leave, they're absolutely lost. I don't think it probably is a majority gender in terms of male, but I also think it is a similar situation with founders of corporates and also non-for-profits, where they can't let go and they've created something that they own or that they believe they own, and they can't walk away, because if they walk away, they've got nothing. And those sort of things are always very difficult, but when you're confident enough and you've got your own brand, personal brand, it's much easier to deal with the issue. Very much like you are your own person, and you've created something that is much bigger than yourself, and it allows that to flourish. Now, when you were talking about your journalist career, you would have also been challenged when we were talking about how other people perceive you. People would have challenged you, I imagine, if you're on the pages of media, of your view, and probably not everyone likes the views you might put forward, and you get all sorts of different reactions to it. Was that something that concerned you, or that made you think about the way others perceived you? Or were you more concerned about and thinking the way you were writing as opposed to the individual?
Was I more concerned?
Yeah.
Do you know what? It's a really interesting question, and I can't say that I was ever bothered by it. What does that say about me? That's interesting. But you know what? I have to say that my journalistic career was probably not that political. You know, I was really writing about lifestyle. You know, that's true, but it was more like my own personal experiences, which weren't necessarily political.
Yeah.
And I was comfortable. Maybe I've always been comfortable in that.
I think so.
Yeah, maybe I have. I guess there were times when I felt maybe I divulged a bit much, and maybe I did decide to take a step back from that to a certain extent.
So you've had experience building a brand in that a career, and people perceived you for what you were or who you were or what you were doing. You then stepped back, went away for a while, came back, and then you started another career. So you actually have rebuilt your own personal brand, if I look at it from an external perspective. So you've done it more than once. Is that right?
I think I have, definitely. And I think doing my PhD was really probably one of the most challenging things I've done, because I felt like I was intellectually stripped bare and challenged. I mean, it really is a mountain, but quite a good experience, because again, it's all about being made humble. I think that's really important to succeed in an endeavour, is that you have to be aware of your own limitations and your capacity and be comfortable with that, because invariably you're going to be criticised, you're not going to achieve what you want. And so if you can be realistic about everything, I think that's helpful. What I was going to say, I suppose, and I know that you talk about values, and we've discussed this before, but for me, the thing that probably motivated me to step away was that the area that I was working in media quite often didn't match the values that I wanted to live as well. So I think that's why I'm more comfortable now with what I'm doing.
You're in your sweet spot, as they say. And I think you're probably reflective of so many who, when the values, and we'll come on to values in more detail, when they don't align, you've got a choice. Just going back to reputation, how important is reputation to you?
Very important. It's very, very important. And I think that that's something, when I think about it, was inculcated at an early age from my parents. I think that a lot of it comes from your own parents. I had a father who was successful, and, he was active in government, and he was a real achiever, and contributed and gave a lot to the community. And reputation was paramount, as it was with my mum. So that is important. And I know values are coming into the conversation later, but that's absolutely tied in with reputation.
Critical. Do you think that when you're talking about the values that your parents instilled in you and the reputation that you've recognised how important reputation is, has come from your parents, when was the first, can you recall when the first occasion was that you maybe even thought how important reputation was? Was it when you were growing up? Was it in your first role? Or is there some...
You know what? I've decided I don't need to go and see a therapist now because you've just reminded me of a story I've probably never told anybody. Can you get out the tissues? I've never told anyone this before. So, yes. No, don't worry. It's fine. I remember I was elected school captain in primary school, and funnily enough, we're going to be implementing the PlantingSeeds B&B Highway in Lane Cove Primary next week.
Fabulous.
And I'm going back. I was elected school captain, and I remember I had to stand up every week and recite the Lord's Prayer and all the rest of it. But I had a birthday party, and I didn't invite the whole class. I was hauled into the principal's office. I didn't know why I was being hauled into the principal's office, and she said, "Judith," because I was Judith then, "I've heard that you're having a birthday party." And I said, "Yes," very nervously. And she said, "Well, I believe there are some people who haven't been invited." And I suppose there were lots of thoughts swirling through my head, thinking, how does she know about this? But anyway, I guess I knew that she was right. And I went home, and my mother, actually thinking about it, must have been really shocked that she hadn't thought about that too, because she always wanted to do the right thing as well. So I invited the whole class. But yes, it made a big impact on me because I thought that it's important to be a good example and to be considerate of everyone around you. So I guess that did have a big impact on me. Now that you've prompted that somewhere in the recesses of my brain.
But so it really started very early in life then, and has stood you in good stead, no doubt.
I guess it has. I think it's interesting. Someone probably should do a study at some point when you've been voted school captain at a young age, when you're 12. I think it probably has a really big impact on you in your life. Yeah.
And to think it only happens to one person in that year. How do they make sure that the others can benefit from that? That's up to the school captain to do something about it, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, an early age when you're 12, you're basically an example. You have to be a role model. You have to be confident, represent others' views. So, yeah, there'd probably be an interesting study in that.
Moving on from that, if we talk about some of your standards, beliefs and ideas, and we've touched on values, and I think they're all very important. Is that also the moment when values were picked up, or did values and how important values were from your parents' perspective? Can you remember an example or some occasion when something wasn't right before when you were growing up, as opposed to your work environment?
Well, I was actually thinking of an experience in my first job. Can I talk about that?
Yeah, sure.
I went for a cadetship with Fairfax, which in those days was the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun, and various other publications. And unbeknownst to me, I was also being considered for a role on their magazines as well, because at that stage they owned 50% Sun Gravure, which was Woman's Day, Cosmopolitan, all those magazines. So I landed this really unusual cadetship, which was 50% of the time working for Cosmopolitan magazine and 50% of the time working for the Sydney Morning Herald. So half the week I was writing Who's Sexy Now and editing the horoscopes and the fashion. And then the other 50% of the time I was doing, admittedly in those days, it was shipping news and things like that, but it was much more important. And I was caught between these two worlds, which was fascinating. And although I did enjoy working for women's magazines because it was like there was that hedonistic vibe and that sort of stimulation and the fun, but it didn't feel right in the end. And so is that values? I think to a certain extent it is. And later on, I can bore you silly with Schwartz's theory of values, which I love. I want to tell the whole world about it. I see everything that everyone does through this prism. But anyway, looking back, it didn't resonate because it was too much about extrinsic fun and hedonism and the veneer and all that stuff, which, for some people it's great and people have to work in that area because we all need it, but it wasn't for me.
Is that values? Is that not feeling comfortable in the environment, what you're used to? I'm not sure. I'm just trying to get from you. Yeah. Is it a discomfort, or is there an area that's just not, the values are just not aligned?
I think that with values for everybody, it's how everything balances. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that they only have certain values. I think we all have the values. We all share basic values, and in every individual, some are more important and more prevalent. So for me, it was out of kilter. It was out of balance, what I was doing then, because for me, I want to contribute to the world. I want talking about those boring values, this theory of values. To me, it's universal values that are important. I believe in, universal in terms of, that's right, the common good. So that can be manifested in people caring about other people, about disadvantaged people, about other species as well. It's a whole gamut. It's larger than self. It's called intrinsic values are larger than self. And I'm not making myself out to be Mother Teresa, but I just think it's a really interesting exercise to identify within yourself what it is that drives you. And I recognise that that's really important to me.
But you didn't recognise that in your first job.
I didn't necessarily want to be working. Did I want to be working for Cosmopolitan? I suppose, yes, I did. So maybe I didn't recognise it. It was just more that I understood over time that I didn't want to head in that direction. I know at one stage I was offered a job as deputy editor of Dolly magazine, and I was 22, 24, I don't remember. If I'd stayed on that trajectory, I often wonder, where would have I gone? Don't know for sure, but I suspect I would have gone up and ended up editing whatever in a big woman's magazine or whatever. And I suppose at that stage, I elected not to do that because I wasn't comfortable with that world. And so I actually ended up working on the Australian on the Australian newspaper, which was a completely different kettle of fish.
So I wonder whether we're talking about values versus beliefs, because
they're both.
There are differences. I mean, the basic values you talk of, I think, are probably within humanity in different proportions, as you suggest, different balance. And some exercise them or hold them closer to their heart than others. But when it comes to beliefs, over time beliefs can change because the world changes, environment changes. And so you sometimes adapt your beliefs. You may also adapt your values, as in some values become more important than others. But at the end of the day, the basic values remain the same. So how important do you see beliefs, for example, or have you seen your beliefs change over time?
Boy, that's a really big question. I find it difficult to distinguish between beliefs and values. I mean, I do, yes, it's how they're manifested. Whether that's beliefs or actions. Perhaps it's a continuum.
Beliefs and behaviours.
And behaviours, maybe, yeah. Beliefs and behaviours, I agree. And a lot of people do have values and then they don't live them. They don't live them for various reasons. They're afraid to, there's too much pressure, they don't have the opportunity. And sorry, what was your question in relation?
So have you seen some of that in yourself change over time?
Yeah, I have, definitely. I think only really in the last 10 years through doing this extra study that I've gained more confidence and an understanding of who I am and how it can be manifest. There's another really interesting area that I think ties into this, which is to do with, I'm sounding like a real academic now, and I'll try not to make it dry. what I learnt along the way. So, okay, here I'm going to talk about Aristotle.
Okay.
Okay, so Aristotle is often used, quite often, his rhetoric theory is often cited in a lot of PhDs these days. Rhetoric theory. Rhetoric theory, which is how to communicate effectively, is really relevant to today. And I'll tell you why. Because back in the day, in the Greek marketplace, there was a speaker, and the speaker had to try and address as many people as possible in this big marketplace, and they had to yell. I mean, a big voice was important, but they had to really think about, how do I talk effectively? So Aristotle's three main components of effective communication are ethos, pathos, and logos. And so I talk about how in today's marketplace of the infoglut, it's very similar. So, we don't necessarily see the people out there, but they're there in abundance and more so. So it's really important that we understand how to communicate effectively. So what I suppose I learned about, or it's been impressed upon me in the last 10 years of working in advocacy in this really difficult area of environment and biodiversity, is that facts are really important. That's the logos. Ethos is really important, and that's the reputation, the ethics, the associated, the organisation that you'll represent, and the pathos. So that's what I wasn't doing. I wasn't giving the pathos enough emphasis. And pathos actually, according to Aristotle, is values and emotion. Mm-hmm. So when you're telling a story, when you're communicating, you have to convey the story, the feeling, tug the heartstrings, make it real. Yeah. What's the term that they all use in social media? Make it relatable. Engage. Tell your story. I was interviewed on Gardening Australia, and Costa, I heard him go to the producer, and then they asked me this question, and it was the best response I gave, which was, I knew what he was trying to achieve, which, where does this come from? Why do you feel so passionately about the environment? And then it came out, because, I remember as a child, I remember all the cicadas, and I remember the koalas that lived in Pittwater, and where are they? And I get so upset. And I remember going down into the bush and looking at the tadpoles grow into frogs. And that is what you have to convey. That's what you have to communicate. And interestingly, going back to values, Aristotle says that values are part of that pathos. So it's emotion and values.
Absolutely. It's the unannounced call to action, because it actually pulls the heartstrings to get people to act on your message. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole other area, which we won't have time to go into, of how do you engage people with other animals, non-human animals. That's a huge area.
That's another podcast, I'm quite sure.
Don't worry.
And you'll be doing the interviewing. If we go down that path of values, beliefs, behaviours, one of the things that's critically important, and it's not often understood, is that you can have the values, the pathos and everything that Aristotle talks of. You can have the beliefs. But if your behaviours don't match your beliefs and your values, you end up with someone who can't be trusted.
That's my PhD.
That is where it is so critical for organisations, for personal branding perspective, that if you do believe in something, it's the walk the talk and talk the walk, which is exactly what you do. So your branding fits in very nicely with your organisation. The fact that you do what you say you're going to do.
Well, interestingly enough, the research there's not a lot of research out there, I have to say, that's super conclusive, but there is some. And that is, if an organisation wants to achieve something that is larger than self, like, all the not-for-profits and all these organisations, then you have to espouse the right values and you have to practice them. There are a lot of organisations that take shortcuts, and there's some really interesting academic studies actually that have looked at this, where they think, let's motivate people to take on solar panels. Mm-hmm. And they might say, because you're saving money. But that actually doesn't lead to the same long-term change in behaviour as then using the values of, you're actually helping climate change. You're helping the urban heat island effect or whatever. I mean, you can refer to both, but it's really important that people don't shy away from thinking of the common good just because it's not sexy. It actually is, and it does resonate with people.
No, it's critically important. So can you think of an event or an instance when you saw yourself as a personal brand?
Well, I guess we've just released a new video that's promoting our organisation. It just came out today, funnily enough. Isn't that weird? And when they were making it, they said, the filmmaker said, we need to use something stronger. And then I said, I was actually interviewed on ABC News. And so they've selected that. And I guess looking as part of the video, and I guess looking at that type of thing makes me realise how important it is. I suppose I'm realising that right through selling PlantingSeeds work, selling the B&B Highway, which is our flagship program, how important it is. Last week I went up to Queensland to address 30 schools for the Queensland Office of the Chief Scientist. And, it's times like that I realise that I have to be the representation of everything.
You are flying the flag, as they say, but the fact is they see you as they recognise that you are the brand that leads the organisation.
Yes, and I think early on, and again, I know we've chatted about this, I did feel a level of discomfort because I sometimes see people who are representative of a brand as being more veneer, like the veneer is important. I think you have to have a level of comfort, as long as you say to yourself that I can match it with the authenticity and the right values. That's
very true. That's very important. And also believe in what you're saying, not just sort of put it on. I do quite some mentoring, and the interesting thing is that a lot of the people who I mentor are working for organisations who are promoting the corporate brand or the non-for-profit brand. And their difficulty occurred when they left the organisation and they had to start working for themselves, like, for example, becoming a consultant or doing something that didn't have the corporate brand behind them. They felt incredibly uncomfortable. They just struggled. And they struggled because it had all been stripped away and they actually had to promote themselves. And I can understand and relate to that. It is a tough graduation and change to make, and it takes time, and you need the practice, but you also need to explore why. And you've obviously done that very well.
Thank you. Well, you need to recognise or find the organisation or the corporation that matches who you are.
Exactly. Very important. So, some reflections on where you've come to now. Are there areas that you think you could have done differently in terms of building your brand? I mean, you talked about the fact that you changed the name of PlantingSeeds. Is there a reason you did that? Food Faith, I think, was the name of the organisation prior to PlantingSeeds.
Food Faith emerged it was a bit of a case study for my research, where I was just trying to look into how to run an event, how to organise people together. And then it became an organisation. It sort of happened through serendipity. Yes, I did believe in the idea. I thought it would be a great way to bring different faiths together to celebrate food and sustainability. It turned out to be, I was warned actually by a few people that a lot of faith groups, a lot of people who work in faith are working at the core of faith groups and not necessarily looking at interfaith. And that proved to be quite difficult, I have to say. And also the area of food isn't scalable. Having community gardens is not scalable. It's very difficult. So I often jokingly say that my 8 years of PhD can be summarised in one sentence in terms of how to make sustainability and biodiversity, how to engage people. I say it has to be, you have to give people the facts. They have to know what's wrong. Otherwise they'll think, what's the issue? Facts, hit them over the head with it. Bad news, that's fine. But simultaneously, make it positive, give them positive responses, solutions that are practical and scalable. So that's why I changed it to PlantingSeeds, and we changed to pollinating gardens and focusing on pollinators that are, threatened, and it's very dire, actually. If we're talking about what's happening to birds and insects and how that connects to food systems and the environment. So that's what we're focusing on, and pollinator gardens, and we have them now in 120 plus Locations in 3 states, growing, vitally important and very scalable.
So I have a question for you in the holistic sense. Biodiversity is such a complex topic. It has so many different components. I wouldn't even like to guess the different components that would make up biodiversity as a descriptor. How do you actually brand these sort of initiatives and these programs so that people who you want to attract and the impact you want to make are going to support, follow and engage with you?
Easy.
Wow.
No, that sounds terrible. No, not really. Okay, so the concept of the meta frame is very helpful. What that means, an umbrella frame that incorporates different elements and it's catchy. Alliteration's helpful here. So, for example, PlantingSeeds flagship project is the B&B Highway. So that stands for, depending on who I'm speaking to, I say it's bed and breakfasts for bees and birds and butterflies and bats and bugs and bush babies and biodiversity. Sometimes I'll say just bees, or sometimes I'll say birds, or sometimes I'll talk about the bed and breakfast, which are the plants. So it's coming up with a concept that is relatable. Bees.
How successful then, just if I may interrupt, how successful is the concept within the industry in terms of coming up with this? Because you've come up with this concept of bed and breakfast, which sounds absolutely relatable. You're one of many thousands who are in that space.
When we talk about bees, there's not many who are doing what we do in terms of pollinators and bugs, and also corridors. So what we do is establish corridors for regeneration through schools mainly, and that's unique. When you think that there's 10,000 plus schools in Australia, that we could be in every one of them in a very affordable way to create corridors in the urban environment, then it has incredible potential.
When you're talking to the schools, are you talking to the kids about values and about beliefs that are important for them to, yes, the bugs and biodiversity is all fascinating, etc., but how much do you weave in the values and the importance of the environment?
A lot. So, we often, I think what gets us over the line in even getting the funding is we talk about corridors of regeneration and learning.
Yeah.
We talk about sharing the knowledge between schools. So when we establish corridors, we go maybe 3-4 schools in a neighbourhood and we say, let's get together at the end of it and have an event and share. So there's that lovely sharing. We talk about to the kids and the teachers and the funders, potential funders, how you can help support biodiversity in your neighbourhood by planting the right plants as well. We recognise that bees are important for people's food, so we will talk about that. We'll talk about how flies pollinate chocolate. That's of great interest to the students. But we also say that we need these insects and pollinators are important for their own sake. So it's just a way of every time you communicate, recognising, yes, that people will think about their own needs, but you have to broaden it as well. And that makes people feel good and intrinsic.
You've got yourself to this point. You're now starting to make significant inroads into schools and in the community. Was there someone that sort of mentored you to get to this point, that helped you to get to where you are today?
I think there's a combination of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely think that my supervisor, even though I hated him half the time, sorry, Chris, if you watch this, he was really tough, but he really took me over the mountain in terms of stretching me. Of course, my husband, Anthony, I think he's always been steadfast and a rock and always believed and stood by me. And it's not an easy road working in biodiversity.
No.
I was going to say earlier that one thing I've learned along the way is not to leave something. I think I've had a tendency to sidestep in my career a lot of the time. And I think sometimes you just have to stick at something.
Persistence.
It can sometimes take 10 years. It can take longer. Probably generally does. Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say, and the people I work with at the organisation, really, they walk the talk as well. I've got a fabulous educator who's like one of the leading environmental educators in New South Wales, Nicole Lewis, and the manager, Kate Fraser. It's a whole heap of people.
So what about in your previous careers? Is there anyone or growing up that was prominent in your mind as a mentor or mentors that...
I was going to say my parents, definitely.
Yes.
I've spoken about them. The various editors I had along the way, I think. I worked for the Australian newspaper. You couldn't be meek and mild and survive in that environment, especially way back then. There were some very well-known male people working there, and they taught me to be steadfast, not put up with the rubbish, and to use humour. And I had an editor at the Sun Herald who really believed in me and put me onto the senior executive when I was quite young, and that gave me a lot of confidence too, David Hickey.
Mm-hmm.
And my kids, I was actually thinking about this. You don't realise it quite often that when you start thinking about your kids, especially they get to a stage where in their 20s, 30s, that they actually have similar values, I think, to what I have and my husband has.
And you wonder where it came from.
Yes, it's funny about that, isn't it?
Yes. It was always there, and they've obviously developed them over time. So do you spend any time mentoring others?
Well, we were talking about this morning because I was telling people, a few of the team, this is what I was doing today. And I was saying to them, and who have your mentors been? And in fact, one of them said you, which was nice, which I thought, oh, that's lovely. So I'd like to think that I have mentored some of the people I've been working with.
Fantastic.
I mean, we have a lot of volunteers. I came from the office today and there were 14 people there, most of whom are volunteers and many of whom are students doing undergrads or masters, some doing PhDs. And I was explaining to one about how to do qualitative research and content analysis. I was explaining to another, we were talking about the nature repair market and looking at the implications of that. So I enjoy the role. I enjoy the many different facets of what the organisation involves and the different directions it goes in, and hopefully supporting the people coming through.
Fabulous. So in conclusion, if you were to put into summary where you are today and how that fits with your brand, your values, your beliefs, is there any advice you can give to younger people who are up and coming, who really aspire to run an organisation and develop the skills and become as prominent as you are in the role you're in?
It's very kind of you. I don't necessarily see myself that way. But I think that someone asked me a while ago, or quite recently, how do you see success? And it made me realise that, especially in this very difficult area, I suppose there's lots of areas like biodiversity, but it's really hard, and that you have to be realistic about it and not get too disenchanted. I probably have an existential crisis once every month, because it's really, if you start reading about what's happening to the world, it's really depressing, especially when all the species depletion, etc. But you just have to stay on the road and plant some seeds. And when I think back, I can see that, yes, they are growing and there's all sorts of potential developments. I mean, this year is the year that the nature repair bill are being put to Parliament. There's the whole nature repair biodiversity emphasis now, and biodiversity credits. That's the whole area. I mean, I'm not saying I'm responsible for that, but, a lot of people are contributing to this now movement afoot and this recognition. So you have to just stick at it, stay the course, be realistic and use your knowledge, associate yourself with the right ethos, organisations and people, and also share the passion. Be aware of who you are, your passion, your values. Don't be afraid to let it out and be effusive.
I think you have just hit the nail on the head. The passion, and not only the passion, but the compassion and the knowledge and understanding that you've shared with us today. I mean, it's been a real treat, and I want to thank you, Judy, so much for taking the time to come in and really discuss. We started off talking about branding, but we've covered so many other aspects, which is what biodiversity is all about.
Including the meaning of life.
Absolutely. So thank you once again. A great privilege and pleasure.
Oh, no, thank you. It's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe for more episodes. And if you'd like to learn more about developing your personal brand, please visit garrybrowne.com.au to get in touch or grab a copy of Brand New, Brand You.